The night was cold, with the autumn wind rattling the trees and sending shivers down the spines of those brave enough to wander the streets on Halloween. Somewhere in the shadows of a forgotten town, a pumpkin patch lay waiting, abandoned for decades, shrouded in eerie silence. Locals whispered about the horrors that happened there. Some said the soil had been cursed. But every year, there were those foolish enough to enter, never to be seen again. Liam had never been the type to believe in ghost stories. At 24, he was a recent college graduate, chasing after the thrill of adventure. Amy and Derek, his closest friends, had moved to the same small town in search of a fresh start. Amy, with her pragmatic attitude, always rolled her eyes at Liam's reckless nature, but secretly, she liked the adrenaline rush that came with his antics. Derek, on the other hand, loved horror movies, often talking about demons, curses, and the supernatural with a little too much enthusiasm. One fateful Halloween, as they were scrolling through urban legends of the town, they stumbled upon the story of the cursed pumpkin patch, a place where people entered but never came out. It had been overgrown, left to rot, and no one had dared to touch it for decades. "It's just a bunch of pumpkins," Liam scoffed. "Let's go see for ourselves." Amy was hesitant, but Derek, always up for a thrill, agreed. Little did they know that by entering that pumpkin patch, they would awaken something ancient, something evil. The trio arrived at the patch just as the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the horizon. The place felt wrong. The pumpkins, which should have been bright and festive, looked decayed and diseased, their skin warped and peeling. The air was heavy with the scent of rot, and the wind whispered as if it carried voices. The more they walked, the quieter it became. No sounds of the town, no wind rustling through the trees. Just silence. As they ventured deeper, Derek spotted a scarecrow in the distance. It was tall, much taller than any scarecrow they had ever seen, with a twisted, grinning face made from sewn-up sacks and straw. Its button eyes gleamed in the twilight, staring right at them. Suddenly, a thick fog rolled in, and the temperature dropped. Liam's breath fogged the air in front of him. "We should leave," Amy said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it was too late. The ground beneath them began to shift, and the pumpkins that once lay dead and decaying started to move. Their vines came alive, slithering toward them like snakes. Before they could react, Derek screamed. The scarecrow was no longer standing in the distance. It was moving toward them, its straw feet dragging through the dirt, its stitched-up smile stretching wider. Derek tried to run, but the vines coiled around his legs, pulling him to the ground. The scarecrow was upon him in seconds. It knelt down, its hollow button eyes fixed on him, and with one sharp, brutal motion, it plunged its straw-like fingers into Derek's chest. His screams filled the air as the scarecrow ripped out his heart, its grin widening as blood dripped from its hands. Derek's body convulsed before going still. Amy and Liam turned to flee, but the vines caught Amy next. They dragged her screaming into the ground, the earth opening up to swallow her whole. She thrashed and clawed at the dirt, but it was no use. The last thing Liam heard was her muffled cries as the soil buried her alive. Liam ran, his heart pounding in his chest. But the scarecrow was faster. It grabbed him by the shoulder, its fingers like iron claws digging into his skin. He struggled, but it was no use. The scarecrow lifted him into the air, and with one swift motion, tore his head from his body, tossing it into the patch like another rotten pumpkin. The next morning, the pumpkin patch looked as it always did, abandoned, lifeless, and still. But the townsfolk knew better. They had heard the screams that night, the echoes of horror carried by the wind. The legend of the cursed patch grew, and every year, the pumpkins seemed to grow larger, their skins twisted, as if absorbing the souls of those who dared to enter. In the forgotten house on Maple Street, something evil lurked. No one lived there anymore, not since the strange deaths of the previous owners. Yet every Halloween, a dim light flickered in the attic window. The townspeople said the house was cursed, that a mirror hidden within its walls trapped the souls of those who dared to look into it. And tonight, that curse would claim new victims. Megan had always been drawn to the paranormal. At 22, she had made a name for herself as a rising star in the world of ghost hunting on YouTube. Her channel, Haunted Horizons, had amassed thousands of followers. Her boyfriend, Ryan, was the cameraman and skeptic, always teasing her about her obsession with ghosts. To Megan, the haunted house on Maple Street was her ticket to viral fame. If she could capture something truly terrifying, it would propel her to the top of the ghost hunting world. Ryan, ever the practical one, agreed to go with her, but only for the laughs. "It's just an old house with some broken glass, Meg," he'd say. But Megan wasn't so sure. There was something about that house, something that pulled her in like a magnet. They arrived at the house just as the last rays of the sun faded behind the horizon. The house was dilapidated, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling off in strips. The front door creaked ominously as they pushed it open, stepping into the dark, musty interior. "Let's start upstairs," Megan said, her voice full of excitement. They ascended the creaky staircase, each step echoing in the silence. The attic was their destination, the place where the cursed mirror was said to be hidden. The attic door groaned as they opened it, revealing a room covered in dust and cobwebs. And there, in the corner, stood the mirror. It was tall, its frame made of dark wood twisted into shapes that resembled vines and faces contorted in agony. The surface of the glass shimmered in the dim light, almost as if it were alive. Megan set up her camera, speaking into the lens about the history of the house and the rumors of the cursed mirror. But as she did, she noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. It showed the room, but in the reflection, the walls seemed darker, more decayed. And then she saw it, a shadow moving in the background of the reflection, though there was no one behind them. Before they could react, Ryan's reflection in the mirror moved on its own. His face twisted into a grotesque grin, one that didn't match the expression on his actual face. Megan screamed as she watched his reflection reach out of the mirror, its hand made of shadow and glass. It grabbed Ryan by the throat, pulling him toward the mirror's surface. Ryan's body was dragged into the mirror, his bones snapping as they were crushed against the glass. His reflection, still grinning, waved at Megan from the other side, its eyes glowing with malice. His real body, broken and lifeless, was absorbed into the mirror, disappearing into the cursed world within. Megan tried to run, but the mirror wouldn't let her. The shadowy figure from within the glass reached out, its cold fingers wrapping around her throat. She struggled, gasping for air, but it was no use. With a final sickening crunch, her neck snapped, and her body collapsed to the floor. The mirror absorbed her too, leaving nothing but a faint echo of her final scream. The house on Maple Street remains empty, but the attic light still flickers on Halloween night. Those brave or foolish enough to enter say that if you look into the mirror, you'll see Megan and Ryan, their souls trapped forever, banging on the glass, their mouths open in silent screams. On the outskirts of a small town, a Halloween festival was held every year, a celebration filled with joy, candy, and costumes. But hidden within the fun was an ancient secret, one that few spoke of. Legend said that every 100 years, a demon walked among the people, disguised behind a mask, claiming victims with terrifying brutality. This Halloween marked the 100th anniversary, but nobody believed the old story until the demon returned. Ella was a 19-year-old girl who loved everything about Halloween. She had always been captivated by the stories of ghosts and ghouls, but she didn't believe in them. Growing up in a small town with her best friends, Jake and Sarah, Halloween was the one time they could all let loose. This year, the Halloween festival promised to be bigger than ever, and Ella had picked out a special costume, a vintage porcelain mask, delicate and eerie, which she had found in an old thrift shop. Jake, always the joker, dressed as a vampire, while Sarah went as a witch. The three of them were inseparable and ready for a night of fun. But the moment Ella put on the mask, everything changed. She felt a cold chill crawl down her spine, and for a moment, her reflection in the mirror seemed different, darker. But she shook off the feeling, laughing it off. The festival was in full swing, costumed people laughing, dancing, and playing games. Ella, Jake, and Sarah weaved through the crowd, their laughter blending with the music. But as the night wore on, Ella began to feel strange. The mask felt tighter, as though it was becoming part of her skin. She tried to take it off, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me help," Jake said, tugging at the mask. But the moment his fingers touched it, his face twisted in pain. His skin began to blister, as though his hands were burning just from touching the mask. He screamed, pulling away, and Ella could only watch in horror as his hands melted, dripping away like candle wax. Panic set in, and the crowd around them didn't seem to notice. Sarah backed away, her eyes wide with terror. "Ella, what's happening?" she cried. But Ella had no answer. She could feel something sinister moving beneath the surface of the mask, whispering to her, controlling her. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The lights flickered, and the air grew thick with an unnatural darkness. The crowd finally began to panic, but it was too late. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a demon, wearing a mask identical to Ella's. Its eyes glowed red, and its grin was wide and hungry. Jake, in his agony, tried to run, but the demon moved faster than any human. It reached out with long bony fingers, grabbing him by the throat. With a sickening crunch, it snapped his neck, his lifeless body crumpling to the ground like a broken doll. Sarah screamed, trying to pull Ella away, but the mask had fully taken over. Ella's eyes turned black, her face expressionless. She reached out, her fingers now sharp and claw-like. With one swift motion, she slashed across Sarah's chest, the blood pouring from the deep gashes as Sarah gasped for breath, her body collapsing into the dirt. The demon stood before Ella, tilting its head as if to inspect its work. And then, with a low guttural growl, it reached out and touched Ella's mask. Her entire body convulsed, and with a horrifying scream, her soul was ripped from her body, leaving behind nothing but an empty, hollow shell. The mask fused to her skin, forever binding her to the demon's curse. The next morning, the festival grounds were eerily quiet. The bodies of Jake and Sarah were found, their faces twisted in eternal terror. But Ella's body was never recovered. The only thing left was the porcelain mask, lying in the dirt, its surface cracked and stained with blood. The townspeople whispered that the demon had claimed its victims, and the mask would wait for the next foolish soul to wear it. Long ago, a wicked witch was burned at the stake on the outskirts of town, her curses echoing in the air as the flames consumed her. They say her spirit never truly died, and every Halloween, she returned to seek revenge on the descendants of those who wronged her. This year, her curse would awaken again. The fires had long died, but her hatred still burned, and those who ventured too close to her resting place would face her wrath. Alex had never believed in curses. At 25, he was practical, focused on his job and family. He had returned to his hometown after years of living in the city to help care for his sick mother. Halloween wasn't something he looked forward to anymore, not since his younger brother disappeared on that same night 5 years ago. But his friends, Emma and Max, insisted on having one last Halloween adventure before they all settled down. Emma, always the thrill seeker, had heard about the witch's curse, a local legend that everyone in the town grew up hearing. She convinced Alex and Max to explore the woods behind the old graveyard, where the witch's ashes were rumored to be buried. Alex reluctantly agreed, even though something deep down told him this was a terrible idea. The night was dark, with the full moon casting long, eerie shadows over the graveyard. The trees seemed to reach out like skeletal hands as Alex, Emma, and Max made their way deeper into the woods. The further they went, the colder it became. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and even the crickets had stopped chirping. They eventually came upon a small clearing, where a pile of stones marked the spot where the witch had been burned. Emma, ever the daring one, stepped forward and kicked the stones, laughing. "Come on, Alex, it's just an old legend. There's no such thing as witches." But the moment she disturbed the stones, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. A cold, unnatural fog rolled in, swirling around them. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel something, an ancient, malevolent presence, stirring beneath the earth. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and a hand, skeletal and charred, burst through the soil, grabbing Emma's ankle. She screamed, trying to pull away, but the hand tightened its grip, pulling her down into the earth. Max rushed to help, but as soon as he touched Emma, the fog thickened, swirling around him like a living creature. His body was lifted into the air, his limbs twisting at unnatural angles. He screamed as his bones snapped one by one, his body contorting grotesquely until he was nothing more than a broken, lifeless husk. The fog swallowed him whole, leaving only silence in its wake. Emma, still struggling, was dragged deeper into the ground. The witch's charred body emerged from the soil, her hollow eyes glowing with hatred. With a flick of her bony fingers, the witch summoned flames that engulfed Emma's body, burning her alive just as the townspeople had burned the witch centuries ago. Emma's screams echoed through the night as her body was reduced to ash. Alex, frozen in terror, watched helplessly as his friends were slaughtered. The witch turned her gaze to him, her voice a rasping whisper. "Your bloodline cursed me. Now, you will suffer." Alex tried to run, but the fog pursued him. It wrapped around his throat, choking him as the witch's laughter filled his ears. His vision blurred as he gasped for air, but he never made it out of the woods. By morning, his body was found at the edge of the clearing, his face twisted in agony, his eyes wide with terror. The witch's curse had claimed another victim, and the townspeople knew that next Halloween, she would return again.